Welcome back to the channel. Today, we won't simply observe history through numbers, we're going to step directly inside it. We're heading to a place where all modern technology becomes meaningless. A place where the most powerful army on the planet was once humbled by silence, darkness, and clay. We're returning to Vietnam, but not to the fiery war in the sky with helicopters and napalm bombs you often see in films. We're going deep into the nightmare of claustrophobia, known as the Coochie tunnels. Before we close the trapdoor and turn on the flashlight, make sure you're mentally prepared for what lies beneath. It was around late 1967. The location was the Iron Triangle, a dense jungle sitting at the gateway to Saigon. Above ground, the US military ruled the world. The sky belonged to them. B-52 bombers, flying at altitudes too high for the naked eye to see or human ears to hear. Their engines were turning ancient forests into the cratered surface of the moon day and night. The ground shook in steady rhythms, an artificial earthquake designed to break the enemy's will. Below the surface, tanks and infantry swept through the brush in search and destroy operations. They were equipped with automatic rifles, flamethrowers, and the most advanced radio technology. To an ordinary observer, American firepower was absolute dominance and unstoppable force of destruction. But there was one major problem: the enemy wasn't there. The forest seemed empty, but it was watching. Patrol teams were sniped from a tree line, and they called for air support. And when the smoke cleared, there were no bodies, no weapons left behind, only shredded leaves and churned up dirt. It was a war against ghosts. American soldiers were fighting illusions that struck and then dissolved into nothingness. Frustration hung thick in the humid, suffocating air. The heat pressed down on their shoulders like an invisible weight. It soaked their uniforms with sweat after only a few minutes of movement. But that burning heat was still far more bearable than what they were about to discover. Private John Miller stopped wiping the stream of sweat running into his eyes. He was a tunnel rat, a volunteer for a job that most sane men would refuse. Miller wasn't the tall, muscular action hero type. He was small, wiry, and built for tight spaces. While the rest of the platoon watched the treetops, Miller kept his eyes on the ground. He spotted something unusual near a termite mound, a small wooden plank cleverly hidden under a layer of dry leaves and loose soil. It was a trapdoor. To an untrained eye, it looked like any other patch of forest floor, but to Miller, it was a mouth. It was the entrance to a sleeping city right beneath their boots. Preparation was a ritual of shedding the modern world. Miller handed his M16 rifle to a teammate. It was too long and too cumbersome for the world he was about to enter. He removed his heavy flak vest and steel helmet. Down there, armor was a deadly burden that would only get him stuck. He kept only the absolute essentials: an L-shaped flashlight with a red lens to preserve night vision, a .45 pistol, a dagger, and his own steel nerves. He took a deep breath of the hot, humid air above ground, savoring it as if it were his last, because he knew the air below would be nothing like it. Miller lowered himself into the hole. Its size was truly shocking, only 80 by 120 centimeters. It squeezed tightly against his shoulders, forcing him to twist his body just to fit through. As his head sank below the surface, the shift in his senses was violent and immediate. The roar of the B-52s and the shouts of his platoon were instantly severed. They were replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The temperature dropped, but the humidity rose, carrying the smell of wet clay mold and human waste. He slid the wooden lid back into place above him. The last ray of sunlight vanished. Now only the faint beam of his flashlight cut through the dense darkness. He was now in enemy territory. The walls were laterite clay as hard as rock, with tool marks still etched into them, a testament to thousands of hours of manual labor. Miller was no longer a soldier of a superpower. He was an intruder inside a massive living organism beneath the earth. The tunnel stretched ahead like a black throat waiting to swallow him whole. He was still alive, but as the darkness pressed against his skin, he realized a horrifying truth up there. He was the hunter, but down here, in the deadly silence, he was the prey. Miller's world had now shrunk to the diameter of a flashlight beam. He crawled forward on hands and knees, feeling rough clay scrape through his uniform and against his skin. The tunnel wasn't straight. It was architectural cruelty, designed in zigzags to destroy human orientation. Every few meters, it jerked violently left or right. This wasn't random. It was meticulous engineering meant to stop straight-line gunfire and limit grenade blast radius. But to Miller, it meant death could be waiting less than a meter ahead. Just around a blind corner he couldn't see. He was forced to stop at every turn, holding his breath, straining to hear the click of a trigger or the breath of an enemy. At a depth of 3 meters, the roots of ancient jungle trees had pierced through the ceiling, dangling like bony fingers. Under the trembling beam of his flashlight, they looked like venomous snakes, ready to strike. Miller flinched more than once, heart pounding in his chest, only to realize he had been staring at roots, not serpents. But the snakes were real. He had heard stories of the red-tailed pit viper snakes deliberately released into tunnels, their venom able to kill a man within steps. Paranoia began to creep in, a cold tingling racing down his spine. Every shadow looked solid, every root resembled a lurking predator. He froze. Survival instinct sharpened by months of jungle warfare screamed at him to stop. He lowered his flashlight, sweeping the beam along the ground, just inches from his face. There, stretched tight across the tunnel floor, was a tripwire, almost invisible, a single delicate strand he would never have noticed had he crawled a bit faster. Miller traced the wire with his eyes. It wasn't attached to a claymore or a bundle of explosives. It connected to a pin holding up a false floor. Beneath it was a pit trap, a pit filled with sharpened bamboo stakes, the tips hardened by fire and smeared with human or animal waste, guaranteed that if the fall didn't kill you, the infection would. Miller carefully stepped over the wire, his body trembling as he held a plank position in the tight space. A wave of hopeless realization washed over him, that all his modern equipment was completely useless here. His radio was nothing more than a heavy brick, its static hissing into a void as the earth swallowed every signal. His armor was gone. Air support was miles above him straight up. He was facing a weapon system made of bamboo, gravity, and patience, and it was proving more effective than any technology he carried. The tunnel itself was a weapon. As he moved deeper, the silence began to change. It was no longer the absence of sound, but the presence of something real. Veterans had a name for it, a name. They whispered it to one another, the Black Echo. In the absolute isolation of the tunnels, the mind began to revolt. Miller started hearing things that didn't exist. A footstep right behind him, a whisper brushing against his ear, the rhythmic thump of a heartbeat that wasn't his own. He stopped and held his breath to listen. But the tunnel was completely silent. The sounds were coming from inside his own blood, surging through his veins, amplified by claustrophobic terror. He was fighting two enemies, the Viet Cong and the collapse of his own sanity. Miller had no idea he wasn't imagining that presence. He was being watched. In a narrow slit beside him, hidden behind a thin camouflage mesh perfectly matched to the clay, a pair of eyes observed the soldier's clumsy progress. It was Bay, a seasoned fighter of the tunnel system. He needed no flashlight. He knew the underground world by touch and smell. He saw the beam of Miller's flashlight approaching. Bay didn't fire his weapon. A gunshot in this cramped space would cause permanent deafness and possibly collapse the tunnel. Instead, Bay moved with the fluid grace of a ghost. He reached for a small latch hidden in the ceiling and quietly slid a wooden block over a ventilation hole. He wasn't going to fight the intruder with bullets, not yet. He would fight with air itself, slowly turning the tunnel into a tomb by cutting off oxygen, one ventilation shaft at a time. Miller kept crawling forward, unaware that the air he was desperately drawing into his lungs was already beginning to thin. Miller slid himself down a narrow, steep slope leading to the second level of the tunnel. He was now 6 meters underground, and the atmosphere had shifted from stifling to crushing. The air here was thin, stale, and stagnant, carrying the heavy metallic taste of adrenaline and the sour stench of his own fear. His chest heaved violently, struggling for scraps of oxygen that barely existed. The tunnel walls felt as if they were closing in, pulsing with the rhythm of the earth itself. He had entered the living quarters, the heart of this underground city, but it felt more like the stomach of a beast. He staggered into a slightly wider room large enough to sit up but not stand. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness and stopped on a structure carved directly into the clay wall. It was a stove, a masterpiece of guerrilla engineering known as the Cong stove. Miller had been briefed about these at base stoves designed to channel smoke through long underground vents, cooling and dispersing it miles away as harmless mist. But seeing it here in this darkness was an entirely different experience. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched the clay surface of the stove. It was still warm. Not just warm hot. The heat traveled up his arm and settled in his gut like a stone. Someone had been cooking here just minutes ago. The enemy wasn't just ghosts. They were flesh and blood right here. They breathed the same thin air, and they might be watching him from the darkness at this very moment. That realization shattered what little calm Miller had left. He spun around, sweeping his flashlight wildly across the room. The silence was broken by a distinct sound, a deliberate faint scraping coming from the tunnel he had just exited. It sounded like fingernails dragging across dry earth. Miller froze, weapon raised, eyes wide and burning with sweat. Get out, his mind screamed, but his throat was too dry to make a sound. Bay, hidden in a narrow crawl space running parallel to the main tunnel, watched the American soldier through a peephole no wider than a coin. He held a small stone in his hand. With practiced precision, he tossed the stone into a side passage to Miller's left. It clattered against the hard-packed earth, the sound echoing unnaturally in the confined space. Miller broke. The noise acted like a trigger, snapping the taut wire of his nerves. He spun toward the sound and squeezed the trigger of his .45 pistol. The gunshot didn't sound like a normal gunshot. Above ground, a shot is a sharp crack. Down here, it was a physical udar, a blunt force blow. The explosion was compressed by the clay walls. The sound wasn't heard. It was felt. It slammed into Miller's skull like a sledgehammer. The muzzle flash blinded him instantly. It burned a white scar across his retinas, erasing the darkness for a split second. For several agonizing seconds, Miller was completely deaf and blind. A piercing, shrill ringing screamed inside his head, drowning out every other sense. He staggered backward in panic, disoriented, swinging his weapon at invisible enemies. In his panic, he lost all sense of direction. Which way was out? Which way led deeper? The tunnel had become a kaleidoscope of terror. He crawled forward blindly, his hand pressing against a wall that shouldn't have been there. He was in a dead end. No, it was a deception. Bay had quietly slid a false wall into place behind him, sealing off his escape route. Miller was no longer exploring a tunnel. He was trapped in a maze that shifted around him, where the very walls seemed to move when he wasn't looking. The psychological war had truly begun, and Miller was losing. He was alone with the ringing in his ears and the horrifying certainty that he was being herded like livestock toward a slaughterhouse he couldn't see. Miller was still reeling from the gunshot, his ears screaming with that relentless shrillness when the universe decided to collapse. It began not with sound, but with a vibration. The ground under his boots heaved upward, a violent vertical jolt that threw him against the clay wall. Dirt rained from the ceiling in torrents, choking the already thin air. Then came the noise, a deep, thunderous boom resonating through 6 meters of compacted earth, rattling Miller's teeth in his skull. Above ground, an arc light strike had begun. 3 B-52 flying fortresses were unloading their entire payload in a deadly rhythm, turning the jungle into an ocean of fire and shrapnel. Down here, it felt like lying in a coffin while a giant pounded the lid with a hammer. The tunnel structure groaned under the seismic assault. Neatly carved arches began to deform, cracks spreading across the clay like spider webs on a windshield. Miller scrambled to his feet, panic overwhelming every ounce of training he had. His flashlight flickered wildly in his shaking hand, its beam slicing through the falling dust like strobe lights in a nightmare. He had to get out. He had to find the surface. But in the chaos, the geometry of the tunnel had shattered. He stumbled into a wider chamber, maybe a field hospital, maybe a command node now reduced to rubble by the earthquake. Standing on the far side of the room, leaning against a wooden support beam, was Bay. For the first time, the enemy had a face. He wasn't a monster or a ghost. He was a human being, small-framed, wearing a simple black baba outfit and a checkered scarf. He was barefoot. His skin was stained the color of earth, making him look as if he had been sculpted from the tunnel itself. He carried no weapon. The tremors had knocked his rifle out of reach. For a split second, the two enemies locked eyes through the trembling darkness. In Bay's eyes, Miller saw no fear, only a terrifying cold calculation. This American was an alien invader in Bay's home, a clumsy giant thrashing inside a web he could not understand. The shock of recognition shattered. Miller raised his weapon, but another shockwave from the bombing threw him off balance. The ground lurched violently. Bay used the momentum, launching himself not away from Miller but straight at him. This wasn't a cinematic martial arts move. It was a desperate feral lunge. They collided in the center of the shaking room. Miller was bigger, heavier, raised on steak and milk, but in this collapsing, confined space, his size was a disadvantage. Bay moved like water, slipping past Miller's flailing arms, striking with elbows and knees at pressure points. They grappled in the murky darkness of the flickering flashlight rolling across the uneven floor. Miller dropped the flashlight. It skidded away, casting wild dancing shadows that made their struggle look like a demonic ritual. Miller grabbed Bay's collar and slammed him backward, but Bay twisted and kicked hard into Miller's knee. Miller collapsed. The American soldier reached for his dagger, but the floor beneath them gave way. The B-52s had done their job too well. The load-bearing structure of the second level had failed. A section of floor collapsed into a hidden chute leading down to the third level. Miller lost his footing. He clawed at the air at the dirt at Bay's clothing, but gravity won. He fell backward into the abyss, sliding down a steep, dark throat of earth, leaving the light and the world behind as he plunged into the deepest level of hell. The fall did not end with a loud impact, but with a suffocating embrace. Miller slammed into a pile of loose earth and broken clay at the bottom of the chute. The violent impact drove all the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping like a fish stranded on shore, but the air down here offered no salvation. He was now on the third level, 12 meters beneath the surface. The oxygen level here was dangerously low, barely enough to sustain fading consciousness. The air was heavy, stagnant, and reeked of ancient decay, a mixture of wet clay, rotting roots, and something metallic and foul, like dried blood. Miller lay still for a moment, waiting for his eyes to adjust, but it never happened. The darkness here was absolute. It wasn't simply the absence of light. It was a physical weight, a thick velvet shroud pressing against his wide-open eyes. He fumbled for his belt, his fingers clawing frantically for his backup flashlight. It was gone, torn away during the fall, or the struggle. He slapped the ground around him, his hands striking cold, wet mud. There was nothing. The truth hit him with the force of a punch. He was blind. He was buried alive in a grave that stretched for miles, and he had lost the only weapon he had against the void. A cold, razor-sharp panic began to rise in his chest. He tried to stand, but the ceiling here was lower, forcing him into a permanent crouch. He reached out and touched the wall. It was slimy, coated with a slick layer of moss or fungus thriving in eternal darkness. He began crawling, dragging his bruised body forward, with no concept of direction. Up, down. Then the sensations began. First, a faint tickle on his neck. He slapped at it, thinking it was a bead of sweat. But then he felt it on his wrist, then his ankle, then his feet. The tunnel was waking up. He had crawled into a nest of fire ants, or perhaps something worse. In the pitch-black void, his imagination weaponized every touch. Was it centipede scorpions, or just harmless roots from the forest above? He had no way to see, and that ignorance fed the terror. He began thrashing wildly, slapping at his own body, tearing at his uniform to fling the invisible intruders from his skin. He screamed a ragged primal sound of pure terror, but the wet clay swallowed the noise instantly. No echo, no reply. No one could hear him. He was screaming into a vacuum. Exhausted, Miller collapsed against the tunnel wall, his breaths broken into sobbing gasps. The physical struggle gave way to psychological collapse. The black echo returned stronger than before. In the sensory isolation of the third level, his mind began filling the void with hallucinations. He saw colors that did not exist. He heard the laughter of his comrades back at base. He heard a radio playing a song from home. Then the sounds began to distort. Laughter turned into desperate screaming. Music became the shrill buzzing of insects. The darkness began to take shape, forming vague faces emerging from nothingness. The face of an enemy soldier, the face of his father, and the face of his own corpse. Miller curled into a fetal position, rocking back and forth in the mud. His arms wrapped tightly around his head to keep out the demons that existed entirely inside his mind. He was no longer a soldier. He was a shattered child, trembling in the dark, waiting for monsters to come for him. As Miller lay curled in the mud, his mind drifting toward the final blackout of unconsciousness, a sensation yanked him back from the edge. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but to his starving senses it struck with the force of a storm. A breath of wind, a thin stream of air brushing across his cheek. It was not the stagnant, recycled stench of the tunnel. It smelled of rain, wet leaves, and ozone. It smelled of the surface. His eyes flew open. In the pitch-black darkness ahead, a miracle appeared, a tiny gray speck of light. It was faint, as if filtered through a long ventilation shaft, or an exit near a riverbank, but it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Miller scrambled upright, ignoring the exhaustion screaming through every muscle. He clawed at the earth to move forward, dragging his body through the slick mud. The light was the only reality that mattered to him. It promised oxygen. It promised escape. It promised life. The hallucinations evaporated, replaced by a single obsession. He moved faster, abandoning all caution. He forgot the tripwires. He forgot the sharp turns. He forgot the enemy. The tunnel seemed to straighten. It guided him towards salvation like a merciful hand. But the tunnel was not merciful. It was a machine, and Bay was its operator. Hidden in the darkness of a parallel shaft, Bay watched the frantic progress of the American soldier. He held a thin cord in his hand, waiting in perfect stillness. Moments earlier, he had pulled this cord to open a concealed shutter at the end of a dead-end corridor, allowing daylight to slip in as bait. He knew exactly what the American was feeling. He knew that hope was a far more potent weapon than a bullet. A desperate man is a careless man. Bay felt no hatred, no pity. He simply waited, his breath slow and steady, merging seamlessly with the stillness of the earth. Miller reached the source of the light. It shone from an opening directly above him, a vertical shaft leading upward. He could make out the green of a leaf. Tears streamed down his face, leaving channels through the grime. He gathered what strength he had left and lunged forward, reaching for the edge of the opening. Click. A small mechanical sound and the end. The ground beneath Miller was not solid earth. It was a perfectly balanced, rotating frame, carefully camouflaged. As his weight pressed down, the frame flipped open like a trapdoor. There was no time to scream, no time for regret. The light vanished. He didn't fall far, only about 2 meters, but the landing was designed to finish him. He crashed down onto a bed of sharpened bamboo stakes. They pierced through his uniform and sank into his flesh with horrifying ease. The pain exploded, blinding, burning, and absolute. He gasped for air, but the fall had driven all breath from his lungs, leaving him pinned in the darkness, unable to move without worsening the agony. Above him, the floor rotated back into place under the pull of a counterweight. The latch clicked shut. The gray light was instantly severed. Bay released the cord, sealing the shutter closed. The trap had worked perfectly. He turned away, leaving the American soldier alone with unbearable pain. The tunnel returned to its natural state, silent, dark, and patient. Time lost its meaning in the darkness. For Miller, the sharp agony from the bamboo spikes eventually dulled, settling into a cold, steady pulse. The adrenaline that had fueled his final desperate charge evaporated, leaving behind a heavy numbness like an opiate. He tried to scream again, but his voice was nothing more than a dry whisper. It did not carry beyond the clay walls of this vertical coffin. Above him, the trapdoor was sealed tight, a heavy lid blocking not only the light but the world of the living. The roar of the B-52s, the sergeants shouting, the murmurs of the jungle, all of it now belonged to another universe. Down here, only the metallic scent of iron and clay remained. The tunnel had swallowed him. He was no longer an invader. He had become a part of the architecture, another secret buried within the maze. As his consciousness began to unravel, at its final edges, the terrifying black echo returned one last time. But this time, it was no longer frightening. It felt like a lullaby. The earth was whispering to him, welcoming him into its eternal silent embrace. The darkness was no longer the enemy. It was the only companion he had left. Above ground, the war continued with indifferent brutality. The squad waited at the tunnel entrance for 10 minutes. Then 20. They shouted into the hole, their voices swallowed by the void. They dropped a colored smoke grenade, watching the purple clouds sink into the earth, but no response came back. No tug on the safety line, no signal at all. The sergeant made a calculation based on protocol and probability. Sending another man down would be offering a sacrifice to the monster. The tunnel had claimed its due, and with cold finality, they tossed an explosive charge into the entrance and retreated. The detonation was a low, muffled thud that barely disturbed the forest canopy. But deep below, it collapsed the entry shaft, sealing the tomb forever. In the daily casualty report, Miller's name was typed in clean, administrative font. Listed as missing in action, MIA. No body would be sent home, only an empty coffin and a question mark that would haunt a family in Ohio. Deep beneath the sealed entrance, life continued. Bay did not celebrate his victory. There were no cheers, no satisfaction. He merely washed the clay from his hands in a small underground well and moved into a lower chamber. Here, the air was still thin, but it was filled with human warmth. He joined a circle of his comrades, men, women, and even children, sitting around a dim oil lamp. They were sharing a simple meal of boiled cassava dipped in sesame salt. The scene was striking in its normalcy. Just meters above them, the war machine was tearing the world apart. But here among the roots of the earth, a community endured. Bay picked up a piece of cassava. His face lit by the flickering flame was completely calm. He was not a superhero, nor a villain. He was a survivor, a human being who had adapted to an environment that rejected all others. The Kuchi tunnels were not just a military strategy. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit when pushed to the absolute brink. They proved that steel and fire could tear open the earth, but they could not break the people who had fused themselves with it. The Americans fought a war of attrition, counting bodies and measuring territory, but they lost the psychological war. They could not defeat what they could not see. They could not kill what had been buried. The tunnels endured a vast breathing network. They outlasted bombs, poison gas, and soldiers. Years later, the forest grew back, covering the scars of the B-52 craters. Tourists now crawl through expanded and clean sections of the tunnels, taking photos and marveling at the ingenuity of the construction. They laugh nervously as they squeeze through the tight spaces, eager to return to the gift shop. But if someone wandered off the guided path and found an old decaying collapsible section deep in the unlit darkness, and if they turned off their flashlight and held their breath, they might still hear it. The black echo, the faint rhythmic thumping of a heartbeat in the dark, A reminder that history never truly dies, it merely waits beneath the surface. Thank you for journeying with us into these shadowed depths. The story of the Cu Chi tunnels is a brutal reminder that in war, the most dangerous weapon is not what you hold in your hands, but the will to survive against impossible odds. If this dive into the psychological horrors of the Vietnam War moved you, please hit the like button. It helps us bring more hidden historical stories to light. And if you want to explore more untold narratives, be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. What other historical mysteries or psychological battles should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below. See you in the next videos. Stay curious and stay safe.